Okay, this is Mark Warhol from BeyondEducationUniversity.net, BUniversity.net, and it's 11 o'clock on a Friday night, and I want to share something really fascinating with you. Kind of saying it's kind of the unification theory of all information I've been gathering over these years. It's kind of coming to a head and makes a lot of sense. Let me show you some things really interesting on some websites. Right here is a video about polar shifting that's going on. And in this polar shifting that's being acknowledged, this actually website is CBS, and talked recently about Tampa and Florida about the compass becoming more and more inaccurate because of the quick polar shifting that's occurring.
When
right
most
now.
people hear North Pole, they think of Santa Claus. And while he'll always be at the very top of the world,
there's also a magnetic pole, which is produced by fluctuations or flow of iron in the core of the Earth.
Dr. Chris Connor of USF explains that the constantly moving molten iron acts like a giant car alternator, creating a magnetism on a planetary scale with a magnetic north and south pole.
But over the last few decades, it's been moving, and now it's moved all the way from northern Canada into northern Siberia.
Which means what your compass shows as north in Tampa Bay isn't really north. And this is a problem for airports.
When a pilot navigates, he needs to find which the correct runway to land in or take off on. So he uses his compass in his cockpit to orient himself. They'll tell him that he's on the correct runway.
Robert Burr of TIA says runway 36 originally pointed due north to 360 degrees. Or it did before the magnetic shift. Now it points just right at 10 degrees north, even though physically it hasn't moved. While the runway in question will always point to the true geographic North Pole, because the magnetic North Pole has now shifted, pilots who use compasses lining up on the runway may think they're in the wrong spot unless this problem is corrected. So TIA has resolved to paint new numbers to match the pilot compass readings. Now runway 36 is runway 1. But this may only be a temporary fix. Several times per million years, Earth's magnetic pole does a full flip. At first, it becomes disorganized, with new poles popping up in odd places like the equator, bringing the green and red northern lights to the skies of Florida. The last shift was over 700,000 years ago, leaving some to say we're due.
Some people have speculated that there's a shift beginning,
which may explain this recent fluctuation. But because our lifetimes are a blink of an eye in the geological timescale, it's too soon to tell.
I just said I have to backpedal on that nerd comment. I said, oh, he's so cute. No one will think I was really calling him. I just want Keith to do his nerd impression because it's so good.
Who needs an impression? He's here. No, Brooks.
Exactly.
Hey, listen, but you said something interesting to me, that birds and wildlife out there could actually be confused by all of this.
If, in fact, birds navigate by compass direction, an internal compass, which some theorize they do, if, in fact, the poles shift, it's possible, and this is obviously not going to happen now, but maybe in a couple hundred years or longer, we don't really know. It's possible you could have Canadian geese migrating to Hawaii instead of Canada. Wow. Hey, a North Pole could pop up over Tahiti. You could have northern lights in the south equatorial regions. Pretty crazy to think about.
Yeah, it is kind of mind-boggling to think about, but it's serious too, especially if the instrument of if you're a pilot, air or sea. I mean, your destination
10 degrees. 10 degrees doesn't sound like a lot, but if you go one direction for 1,000 miles and you're 10 degrees off, that could make all the difference.
Absolutely. Well, that's very fascinating.
Thank you for clearing that up.
You got it.
I think that the pole shift is occurring a lot quicker than it has. And if we're going through a phase of a really quick polar shift, where the magnetic poles are changing, it could be a dramatic change in weather. Also, we get into the issue here where NASA talked about magnetic portals connecting Earth to the Sun. And basically, it's right here. It says it's called a flux transfer event, or an FTE. And the flux transfer events were space particles, primarily coming from cosmetic space, and generated mostly from the Sun, penetrate our atmosphere, which might explain when the birds just recently in Arkansas started falling from the sky. There could have been a small flux transfer, It actually showed up in the weather radar. There was a real small solid space that was not weather precipitation, the meteorologist said, and it just kind of appeared and then disappeared. So when I started researching that more, some things started coming to mind. I remember this picture here, the mystery UFO hail over Moscow. And hardly anybody talked about it. It disappeared quickly, but this could be another flux, space particles coming through. And then I finally came up to this right here, coming. Boeing whistleblowers a warning. This article that I read. I would copy this URL and read it for yourself. It has some amazing stuff. It gets into quantum physics. It's pretty complex. It has a lot of referencing, short points, a lot of NASA points that are made. Very scientific and factual. There's a lot of conjecture also thrown in there. But that's why it's time to go beyond education, people. This is a very, very, very interesting concept. And potentially could be a reason that explains a lot of things that I've noticed, like what I thought were chemtrails and barium aluminum being put and sprayed into the atmosphere, which is kind of a no-brainer. Anybody who looks into space, they know that there's stuff's going on there and they're not contrails. And instead of it being a nefarious reason, it might even be our own government trying to delay so preparation, I'm sure, for them is completed. A simple folk, kind of on our own. So be prepared, do your research, and go beyond education. This is Mark Worrell from BeyondEducation.net saying goodbye.